The goal of this video lecture is to review the psychodynamic approach to explaining the symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. So remember that when we're talking about the psychodynamic approach, we're emphasizing the role of unconscious processes, and often we're emphasizing the importance of early childhood experiences in creating these unconscious processes. So from a traditional psychodynamic perspective, Freud viewed obsessions as the result of unconscious conflict or unconscious anxiety. But the way that these reached consciousness was that they were distorted by defense mechanisms that would hide the true nature of that unconscious anxiety or conflict. For example, someone might have unconscious anger at their parent, but the superego might say that that anger was unacceptable. So a defense mechanism, such as displacement, might displace that unconscious anxiety onto another object. So we saw the same process happen with specific phobias, where that anxiety got displaced onto another object. In the case of what Freud would call obsessional neurosis, the anxiety gets displaced onto another object, but rather than being associated with something like a phobic object, these intrusive thoughts occur that represent this unconscious conflict. So this anxiety or conflict repeatedly breaks into awareness via these obsessive thoughts, but the obsessive thoughts may not actually show the true nature of that underlying conflict. So similar to what we saw with post-traumatic stress disorder, we are viewing these intrusive and obsessive thoughts as being driven by the activity of the unconscious. And when we have too much conflict or too much anxiety that is present in the unconscious, they are breaking through into conscious awareness, but via various defense mechanisms, particularly defense mechanisms like displacement and projection, the content of the obsessive thoughts has often been distorted and is not giving us accurate information about the real nature of that unconscious conflict or anxiety. Similarly, Freud viewed compulsive behaviors as defense mechanisms, particularly defense mechanisms against the anxiety created by these obsessive thoughts. So Freud saw compulsive behaviors as ways that people attempted to manage the anxiety from their unconscious conflict or from the obsessive thoughts themselves. So compulsions are behaviors from a Freudian perspective that are driven by the ego in an attempt to manage unconscious conflict, unconscious anxiety, and the anxiety caused by obsessive thoughts. And Freud thought that the origin of these obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors and these unconscious conflicts lay in problems experienced particularly during the anal stage of development. So remember, the anal stage is occurring during toddler years, around the age of 2 to 3. And during the anal stage, the child is learning to control themselves in their environment. So one of the big developmental accomplishments of the anal stage is potty training and learning to have control over your own bowels and bladder. So Freud said that problems during the anal stage of development can lead an individual to develop a fixation at this stage, which can lead to problematic behaviors. So you may have heard someone use the phrase anal retentive. This is a kind of common use term that is similar to what Freud would call an anal fixation. So when people have very rigid behaviors, they may engage in compulsive behaviors and have a lot of anxiety. Freud saw this as having its origin during the anal stage of development. So when parenting behaviors were problematic during this stage of development, for example, parents who were overly rigid during potty training, or parents who relied too much on punishment during the process of potty training, the child could then become fixated in the anal stage of development, and this would be reflected in those various character traits and behaviors. And one of the important mechanisms for this was the development of the superego. So if the parents engaged in these behaviors during that anal stage of development, the child might develop a superego that was too strong, and that could result in these kinds of problems that we see later in development. So one thing that you could consider is that having an overly strong superego might lead someone to be more likely to experience unconscious conflicts that could produce obsessions and compulsive behaviors. So the overall psychodynamic approach sees both obsessions and compulsions as being driven by unconscious processes, unconscious anxiety and conflict, and both of them are representing defense mechanisms. So in obsessions, the true content of the anxiety is being distorted, and the compulsive behaviors themselves are defense mechanisms to protect against the anxiety that individuals are experiencing. And Freud sees all of these processes as being driven by problems that are occurring often during the anal stage of development. So as an example, I'm briefly going to tell you about one of Freud's most famous case studies. This is from a case study called Notes Upon a Case of Obsessional Neurosis, but has more colloquially been referred to as the case of the rat man. So that is because this patient, whom Freud briefly treated in psychoanalysis, experienced symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, and one of the most kind of notable was that he had repeated obsessive thoughts about negative things occurring to his father and to his fiancée. And one of the more graphic obsessive thoughts that he had obsessive thoughts that a rat or a mouse would start biting at his father or his fiancée's anus and chew its way through and into their body via the anus. So because of this kind of very salacious detail, this case study is also often referred to as the case of the rat man. So this case study is characterized by a number of intrusive obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. They were very wide-ranging. Many of his obsessive intrusive thoughts had to do with being worried about something harmful happening to his fiancée or his father. An interesting detail about this is that at the time that he was having these obsessive thoughts, his father had actually already passed away. So he was having intrusive thoughts that something bad would happen to his father, but he knew that these were irrational because his father was in fact dead. And he had a very, very wide range of compulsive behaviors that he used to manage these intrusive thoughts. Things like checking behaviors, seeking reassurance from other people, engaging in repeated behaviors. And by the time he sought assistance from Freud, these were really taking over his life and he was in great distress. So Freud saw the root of the rat man's obsessional neuroses as lying in his childhood experiences. So some of the experiences that the rat man reported remembering from childhood were experiences where he had been shamed around his sexuality. So for example, being scolded severely for engaging in self-pleasure when he was a young child. So Freud looked back at these experiences and thought that he had developed an overly strong superego from these experiences, and he had become fixated in his anal stage of development. As a result of this, he had a high level of unconscious anxiety, but he could not become aware of this because that was unacceptable, particularly his anger at his parents for their inappropriate responses to his very normal childhood exploration. So through defense mechanisms, this anger at his parents became distorted into obsessive intrusive thoughts about something bad happening to his father. He also had a lot of unconscious anxiety around sexuality. So for example, anxiety around sexual attraction to his fiancée. And these unconscious thoughts and unconscious anxiety became distorted into intrusive thoughts about sexual behaviors related to his fiancée. So his obsessive and intrusive thoughts are being driven by these unconscious anxieties, and his compulsive behaviors, so his checking behaviors, seeking reassurance, this very, very wide range of behaviors that he would engage in, were all attempts to manage this unconscious anxiety that he was unaware of. So through the process of psychoanalysis with Freud, he became aware of the nature of the unconscious anxiety that he was experiencing and was able to bring those unconscious anxieties into awareness, and this helped begin the process of starting to resolve some of these obsessional neuroses. So this is an example of a traditional psychodynamic interpretation of symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, where we're focusing on the role of unconscious conflicts, we're focusing on the role of defense mechanisms, and we're really highlighting the importance of what individuals are experiencing, particularly during that anal stage of psychosexual development in early childhood.